turkey tonight, if that's not the subject. Just sort of try to stay somewhere close to the rail line, and we appreciate that. So, John, I'm very apologetic. I can't read off a nice summary of your program.
That's okay.
John always gives a good one, and always enjoy listening to him. He has such an excellent presentation ability. You know, after doing his bachelor's degree over in England and suffering his way through the Second World War, which we never had any of the direct effect of either the Nazis or the Japanese flying over Dallas and dropping bombs on all of our buildings. And so I admire anybody who made it through that. So he really does have my admiration. But then went to work, Xerox went over and hired him and brought him to the United States, thank goodness. After working up in the Northeast, he ended up down here, thank goodness. And he was able to go out to the University of Dallas and had, I think, a master's and a PhD on top of that. So the guy has a little bit of education. He can sort of talk the talk, you know. But he does not talk to us like a professorial elite. Thank you, John. We appreciate that. But we always enjoy John's presentation. So, John, come up and do your own presentation to your program since Jim is incompetent to do it tonight. And we'll really appreciate it. Now, the big question is, did we go over there and push that magic button
Yes,
on
we
the
did.
camera?
I just did.
Okay, good. All right, I think everything's all right.
All right.
John Beesley for the crowd.
I got some food. Well, I have, anyway, thank you all for coming in this inclement weather. It's kind of somewhat brave of you to do that. I know I was out this morning and got drowned once or twice. So I do thank you for coming. And I see all the usual suspects are here, so it should be interesting. One thing I did note, the lady up there that produced this catalogue of billionaires, I was astounded to find that my name wasn't on it. All right. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about America today. Why make America great again? Fat chance. Now, some of what I'm saying will seem to be anti-American. Believe me, I could do a talk about Great Britain, and it'd be worse, because I believe all the politicians since the Second World War have let Britain down badly. So believe me, I could say a lot more about Britain, especially about Margaret Thatcher and so on. Anyway, I have some bottom line remarks to make, which is this. The bottom line, I think, about America is America will never be great again while it has a 17th century political institution, it engages in 18th century economics, it obeys pre-C cultural norms, and it disbelieves scientific evidence. And so with that is sort of a diatribe to begin with. So anyway, let's start the dialogue here. So looking back over the many millennia of human history, sort of civilized history, we see that many nations have risen to prominence and have fallen back into relative obscurity again. So it's sort of quite instructive to see when was America great, why was that so, and why it's not likely to recur. Okay, so towards the end of the 19th century, the US industrial base just about equaled and rivaled that of European countries and Far Eastern countries like Japan. This base, of course, industrial base, was established behind a stiff protectionist barrier, trade barrier. So anyway, the US first appeared on the international stage at the end of the World War I. Woodrow Wilson was the president, of course, and he played a major role, along with leaders from Italy, France, and the UK, in the so-called Treaty of Versailles. Germany and Russia were not much involved with that. And so Woodrow Wilson was somewhat of an internationalist, and he wanted to create international institutions that would avoid future wars and promote international progress. And so the Treaty of Versailles created some of these institutions, such as the League of Nations, the International Court of Justice, and the Bank for International Settlement. Now, most of these institutions are reside today in, not the League of Nations that vanished, but the others reside in Europe. Now, there was a pushback from the Republicans, Henry Cabot Lodge in the Senate, who led an opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, so it was never ratified by the USA. And so for 20 years after the First World War, the USA basically withdrew from international affairs and was basically an isolationist country. However, December 7th, 1941 changed everything when Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And so then America swung into action with huge public deficit spending. And of course that revived the economy, as deficit spending always does. And so by mid-1943, America had a huge military-industrial complex and was mass-producing ships and armaments and so on.
Amazing.
And so by mid-1944, it was clear that the Allies would defeat the Axis powers. And so there was a conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, convened to settle the state of affairs, financial affairs and international trade affairs after the war. And so out of this conference came several institutions, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Now, in 1945, there was an international conference in San Francisco, and that's when the United Nations was chartered. And of course, the building, the United Nations building, was completed in 1952 in New York City. And the IMF, because of the overwhelming power of the US at that point, really, because the Allies were basically ruined after the war, both of those institutions were set up in Washington, D.C. So you can see the dominance of the USA at that time. And I think basically that was probably the high point of American power, basically those years, yes. But I'll get to another lower point next. Anyway, so at that point, the USA gave up being an isolationist country and then became a fully fledged international player, especially as the 1940s wore on and it became a crusade against communism. And so basically from that point on, right up until yesterday, unless things have changed, perhaps today, the USA has been in a perpetual war with one ideologically or another. Now the first hot war, of course, was the Korean War, because in the end of the Second World War, Korea was divided into two, just as Europe was divided into two: East and West Europe, North and South Korea. And so in 50, the North invaded the South. Basically, seemed to be a proxy war, communism against capitalism. That's the way it was seen. And so eventually, the war ended in 53 in a stalemate, an armistice. I think it was never really signed. Maybe, yeah, 1953, yeah. And so basically that was like a draw. Okay, the next conflict, of course, the major one, was the Vietnamese War. Began in 1955 when, in American terms, when American advisors were sent to Vietnam in 1955, and it ended in defeat in 73. And since then we've had the two Iraq wars, and the war in Afghanistan, and we're still there. And it appeared to be a commercially driven war, under the cloak of defeating one version of Islam and throwing out a dictator. And so what's the conclusion about the greatness during this period? We've had several economic wars, and it candidly seems that the US has not really achieved very much. After all, we've had 2 draws and 1 defeat. So I'd say that's for a huge expenditure of blood and treasure. So let's talk about political pressure. So the blood and treasure was expended to defeat and halt totalitarian regimes, the USSR and China. Well, both are still totalitarian, and one of them, especially China, is now a very significant military and economic threat to the USA. So I think not much was accomplished there. In fact, I've got copies of my book are available called Sabotaging America, because I do believe America was one of the few countries that managed to sabotage itself with its actions, and I'll go into that later. And of course, behind the scenes, politically, the CIA has been engaged in covert wars for ideological and commercial gain, which gave access of US corporations, and basically the game plan was to remove all social beneficial programs in those countries, deemed to be socialism. And so basically this was, once Reagan came in, you had the so-called Washington Consensus. And that ran for about 20 years, spearheaded by the neocons. So what did that mean? It meant that there was conservative ideology at home and abroad. And so basically Reagan appointees filled both the IMF and the World Bank, and the IMF especially made unpayable loans to developing countries, especially South and Central America. And so basically when they couldn't pay, then of course the IMA stepped in and said, okay, you've got to pay back, just like Germany has done to Greece, but there's got to be structural adjustment. What is that structural adjustment? Well, you must cut all social programs, privatize all state monopolies, cut barriers to free trade, and eliminate restrictive regulations. So that was basically the Washington Consensus. Now, and after the 2008 crash, again due to financial total incompetence, George Brown was Prime Minister of England and convened a conference in London where all the major financial bankers got together, the Federal Reserve and so on and so forth. And Gordon Brown said, look, this Washington Consensus is now dead. Well, I don't think it's quite died yet. I think it's still continuing on. And now, of course, what's happened is that China is now offering investments to developing countries, and basically it's displacing the USA. And China is building new Silk Roads that lead from every developing country back to China, which is a very significant development. Basically funded by the largesse of America, funnily enough. So let's go to conclusion 2, political effectiveness. So of course we've had overt and covert operations in foreign lands that have not earned the US a terribly good name. It supported dictators and theocracies which do not reflect the loudly proclaimed US ideals of freedom, democracy, and liberty. In fact, the very reverse. The most egregious country is, of course, Saudi Arabia. Okay, then let's get to economic imperialism. Bretton Woods, of course, set up the international financial currency, which was the dollar was the dominant currency, set up at $35 to the ounce of gold. And of course, Lord Keynes had a totally different system he proposed, but that, of course, I've gone over that many times before here. So if you want to hear about it again, you can ask me. So, of course, the first US trade deficit occurred in 1959. So So America had about 15 years of economic greatness and then fell into off the trolley, so to speak. Kennedy's 1961 visit to Europe, when he took along Jackie, was to beg the Europeans to buy gold to prop up the value of the dollar. In 1959, when the Vietnam War was going on, the US had to go back to the IMF to borrow back some of its money to prop up. And of course, in 1973, they totally fell off the gold standard. So that's not a sort of a rip-roaring success, I would say. Because of really overspending, just as the empires do collapse. But in America, we really didn't have an overt empire, but a sort of an imperial empire of control by military means, and it totally went broke doing that. Relying on the kindness of strangers, loaning them money. Not a great conclusion, I would have said. So let's talk about economic effectiveness. So, ignoring the wisdom of John Maynard Keynes, Lord Keynes, the great British economist, it engaged in very costly foreign entanglements, and of course eventually sunk the Dexter-White plan, which was laid down in 1944. And so basically, 1944 to 59, 15 years of American independence. After that, it was the kindness of strangers, lending US money. Talking about social fairness. Now, the boom after World War II, there was the GI education bill. You had corporations offering pensions and health care to the employees and so on. And of course, Johnson's end of the 60s introduced Medicaid and Medicare. So there was a fair amount of what we call a mini welfare state introduced. And so because of the pressure of trade unions, the median wage, which is that's the middle point, the 50% below and 50% higher, the median wage did track the growth in the GDP. So as the US GDP grew, the median wage grew in tandem. And so the French have called this period, 45 to 75, le Trente Glorieuses, meaning the 30 glorious years. I would say that 1976 to 2016, le Quarante Inglorieuses, because it's been for the median wage American, the median wage has departed from the growth. And the reason for that is we've had growing inequality in America. In the mid-75, which is about the peak in the minimum wage, the income relative to the GDP was of the 1% of the population, the top 1%, was about 7%. Nowadays, the income of 1% has grown to over 25%. So most of the income has gone to the top 1%. And of course, the 0.01% has gone up into the billionaire class. And you can see it out there in the community. If you've ever gone around and traveled and talked to people, I mean, people are definitely struggling. Their wages have been decreased and their living has been decreased. Now, if you believe in free trade, the logic of it is to compete, then the wages should drop down to the wages of a Chinese coolie. And that's obviously absurd, but that's the logic of free trade, apart from anything else. So we've seen home ownership, education at the top level, healthcare, have become unaffordable luxuries to the poorest of our citizens. And really that's unacceptable. So why has all this happened? Well, it's the right wing, there's been a right wing pushback in this country. And so this, the US version of what I call the mini welfare state, introduced by FDR and extended by LBJ, was totally abhorrent to the right wing. They just can't bear the government to be doing anything. To their mind, it should all be privatized and the government should step back and do nothing. And I will go on later to point out why this is totally absurd. But that's what they think. So, of course, during the Vietnam War, there was there was a divide in the country. The younger people were against it. The older people seemed to be patriotic and for it. So there were huge amounts of protests on the campus and everywhere else. And this gave way, I think, to a cynicism of the young people towards American institutions. And the figurehead of this inevitable right-wing pushback was a gentleman called Lewis Powell, who later became on the Supreme Court. So in August 1971, Lewis Powell wrote a long memorandum to his chum, Eugene Sydnor, who is director of the US Chamber of Commerce. And basically, the essence of this long memorandum was that American free enterprise system was under attack. So who was attacking it? Well, the young were, they were disrespecting it. The media were. Educational institutions were. And a gentleman called Ralph Nader were. But for the fact we don't hear much of Ralph Nader anymore, we seem to have the same cast of characters causing trouble. And he further went on to say that businessmen, the pillars of the community, were underappreciated and unloved probably. And there need to be a forum for these business people to sort of get their views out so that the American free enterprise system could be protected. And of course, because of that, the US Chamber of Commerce went into action. Over the years, several right-wing think tanks have been created, for example, the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. And they've been pretty successful. And so, of course, at the end of the 70s, a broken down B movie actor named Ronald Reagan was the spokesman for the neocons. And so what was the gist of his themes? What were the main themes? Well, he promoted so-called supply-side economics, and I'll talk about that in a minute. He also promoted the notion that the greedy trade unions caused this huge inflation, which is a total nonsense. He promoted so-called laissez-faire economics. He promoted the ideal of the rugged American who should not group together because she's standalone, being rugged all by himself. And of course, to uphold liberty, freedom, and democracy. And I'd say we're probably losing all of it. And of course, the notion that the very hard-working Americans out there were supporting these scroungers, who lived off society. And of course, as we know, there's a racist tinge in this. Same views are expressed in England, by the way. And the notion that regulation harms business competitiveness. And that there's, of course, too much government is the main problem. And of course, these people stress family values, especially before their people are born, but really don't give a bugger about them after they're born, of course. But they stress it before they're born. They stress patriotism, they love guns, and these are, those are the major themes, but there's many things to go on. And so the huge peasant class, of course, in this country bought these notions, as did much of the Democrat Party, actually. So, what were the basic results of all of this? Well, as I said before, greed ruins everything. And these people promoting this ideology were nothing but greedy. I mean, beyond avarice. So what happened, basically, since 1980? Well, we've seen decreasing industrial competitiveness. We've seen less democracy. increasing inequality, indebtedness, growth of indebtedness at a national and international level. We've seen increasing social stress, strife, and poorer social cohesion. We've seen less compassion, less honesty, and moral behavior. And as Harold Macmillan said about Margaret Thatcher, to fund all of this, the country's been selling off the family silver. Because when you run a trade deficit of up to 20 trillion, that had to be paid for by selling off the family silver. And you'd be, like in England did, the same damn thing. So, now, essentially you'd say the elites have won. Well, the problem with religious elites, they have two major defects. They wish to fund and make their offspring follow their path. The problem is these offspring are never the consistent geniuses as Trump, by his own admission, proclaimed himself to be. When they do take over businesses, they tend to ruin them because they don't really have to study hard, and they squander their trust funds and so on. So really, they're not the people that should be running anything because they're the pampered elite. Also, the laissez-faire supply-side economics that supports the notions of the privileged, powerful few does not work. And I'll go into that in a minute. So laissez-faire, the notion, which is the neocon economic ideology, says that the forces of supply and demand in an unregulated market always leads to an optimum outcome. So you just step back, let the free market work, and it all arrives in an optimum condition. Well, we've seen a few problems with that over the years. We've had disastrous market crashes. It's mostly financial mayhem. In 1929, when the speculative stock market bubble burst. Also in 2001, that's when the dot-com market bubble burst. And of course 2008, when the real estate and derivative market burst. It's really the nature of the financial system and the greed that goes with it that these things will always burst because and so what happened? Well, after this last crash, we had the Dodd-Frank regulation, and of course that's been watered down. Now, who are the market traders that operate this wonderful scheme? Well, basically, they're gamblers with other people's money in a heads I win, tails you lose situation in a rigged casino market. That's what's happening. And the notion that these markets, according to the dogma of the neocons, the market allocates capital fairly is an obvious fairy story. And so basically the free market works on a cavalier emptor principle, buyer beware. And the problem really is the buyers do, on the one, you must have a equal, the buyer and the seller must be on equal basis, but of course the buyer in the modern world can never know the information that the seller has. So he can always be taken, and by and large they are taken. And so, for example, we've had the consumer protection set up. Under this administration, you've had agency capture, where the corporations will write the rules and water down consumer protection. You take the FDA, for example. Now they're unable now to keep the food and drugs safe. The majority of generic and brand drugs activatients now come from China or India. And good luck to you if you need it. Because And of course, the big pharma will never release the country of origin of their drugs and their components. So I think we're in some trouble here. But again, we don't believe in regulation. I mean, why? Because the market is going to take care of it. Well, not in a globalized world, it won't. So let's go to the love of the neocons and such like, and Donald Trump, supply-side economics. Okay? So there are many facets to supply-side economics. I can't touch on them all, but sort of the dogma of neocons is that when you're looking at the economy, you look at the microeconomics. That's to say, the supply and demand of each element, like buying and selling apples or gasoline or something, is really, that can be summed up and describe the whole economy. Well, and of course they believe in limiting government spending and all regulations. Well, the problem is that when you sum it all up to the macro level, which is the whole economy, which I'll talk about in a minute, you can't do that. It doesn't work. And the macroeconomy, different rules apply than the micro level, and I'll explain why in a minute. So what we have now under Trump is the wealthy. You give tax breaks to the wealthy, and they can regulate everything, deregulate everything. And of course, tax breaks and of course, low interest rates. So what do we get there? And now, of course, in the dogma of classical economics, there's J.B. Say was a classical economics professor, French, and he said that supply-side spending creates its own demand. You can see why that might be. You know, the entrepreneur goes out, he builds a factory, he pays his workers, they have the money, they spend it. That's therefore, you can see that in that notion, of course, that could be a notion. Happens to be wrong. I explained that. Now, then came along, so that notion was believed up until 1936. And then came along John Maynard Keynes. So what he did, he took apart the components of supply and the components of demand. He also looked at the intersection of interest and money. And he did that in great detail. And you know, those of you who want to read all of that, and it's worth a read, it's a tough read, but he explains why. I can only go into a few areas. Now, what Keynes said is, yes, in the microeconomy, it could all be in balance, but this does not mean it's in a balance of full employment. In fact, it's unlikely to occur. And so Trump's tax breaks may well cause investment by the rich. Okay, probably does. But where does that money actually go? Does it go back into the productive economy? I doubt it. Much of it will go into non-productive assets, like the stock market. So, you know, the money goes around in the stock market, doesn't necessarily, would never come out in productive businesses. It goes into real estate, and we've seen real estate going up. It goes into gold, it goes into old master painting and so on. So what this country needs is money going into productive assets and factories. But there's no guarantee when you give tax breaks to the wealthy, it doesn't follow that they're going to invest in where we need it, which is the productive economy. Now the spending. Now, according to this theory, this dogma theory, of course, that this money will trickle down to the consumers and they'll spend it. Well, yes, their income, they will get income, but does this translate, as Keynes would say, into demand? will they spend it? And Keynes talked about the propensity to spend. That really depends on consumer confidence. So what you get into in all of this, you get into social factors. These things don't happen automatically, as is the classical economics would say. And so, of course, in uncertain times, consumers don't spend. They tend to hold their money or they pay down their debts. And so then you come to another factor that the Keynes talked about. It's called the liquidity preference. Do you hold your money as cash or invest it? Well, when you have, now in certain times, you know, investment is all, so people tend to hold that money, cash, or they put it in these non-productive assets. So there is no automatic, so says laws really, or doesn't happen automatically, and it basically doesn't work, because that's the way the modern economy works. It really, a lot has to do, as you know, with consumer confidence, investment confidence, and so on. And that's sort of intangible items. And that's one of the salient factors against this neocon economics. It doesn't work anymore. The other factor, of course, is that works in a closed economy, but the US is no longer a closed economy. I mean, you know, as you can see, I mean, if this little money trickling down to the average person is most likely going to be spent buying Chinese goods, the way things are at the moment. There's no guarantee they're doing. No, you go to the store these days, you won't find very many manufacturing goods. They're not there to be bought. And so what you're going to. So the other thing to say about this. Where does the investment? No, the biggest market, in fact, is not the stock market, but the bond market. Now, when you have interest rates as low as they are, you would be foolish to invest in the bond market. And you can ask me why later. But you shouldn't put money in the bond market when you have very, very low interest rates. So the fundamental question really, of course, the Federal Reserve is about to raise interest rates, and that's why you shouldn't put the money in the bond market. And that's one of the biggest markets to put in. So will this largesse by the way, this monthly growth that Trump about 4.1%. Obama had at least 3, 4 or 5 quarters better than that, higher than the 4.1%. So you see, really the economy was on the mend before Trump came along, but of course he, one swallow makes a summer, so trying to. Anyway, so will this bring jobs back? In fact. Especially this tariff situation as well. So this last week we've seen Harley-Davidson relocate its production of the small motorbikes to India. We've seen a case where a Midwestern manufacturer of nails that you bang in with a hammer be affected adversely by these tariffs, because what happened was he switched to US suppliers, and of course the US supplier jacked up his prices to the imported steel that is higher tariffs. Unfortunately now, of course, the import of finished nails undercut him in this new situation. So he's kind of out of business somewhat. That's the problem when an ignoramus does things, that are illogical, really. And so, as I said, the extra trickle-down money would probably create more near-term jobs in China rather than the USA. So what I say about this getting back to greatness again, I think there's a fat chance of a coherent plan here. So let's get to the topic of, socio-economics. Well, I think as you've seen, with the Keynes and what the analysis he did, really, economics is not just sort of like a put it in gear and it goes all by itself. There's much more social factors, as I mentioned, investor confidence, the income demographics, where does the income go? How can they spend it? And of course, cultural traditions. Now, in the Middle Ages in England, in the feudal system, we had a yeoman class who were servants to the lord of the manor. I mean, they were made to serve in his mansions and plough his fields, but they were allowed a certain amount of common land. And even in English today, you'll hear these land, like in Barnet, as the commons. Now, these commons were land where the yeoman who served the lord and worked in his fields and in his house could raise crops and animals, and even engage in cottage industries like weaving. So they were somewhat self-sufficient. They were the backbone of England, in fact, the yeomen of England. And of course, these people supplied the army to defeat the French at Agincourt and Crécy. I mean, they had the longbows, and of course they would go straight through chainmail. So, but all that ended with the Industrial Revolution, and it forced this yeoman class into the cities, because the landowners, textile en masse came into production, and they wanted the land for sheep, so there were masses of enclosures in England. And so the people were either forced into the cities or to emigrate, Australia, America, and so on and so forth. So basically the yeoman class that owned their own livelihood, and of course a yeoman with his own livelihood would never permit his livelihood to be shipped overseas. It's inconceivable that he would let that happen. And so let's talk about economic democracy. I've talked about this before. In fact, the first talk I gave here was on that topic. I believe that America needs a new yeoman class that controls its own economic affairs. I think it's vital that it does. And as I said, the economics of it really should be based on the Mondragon model, which is Mondragon is an employee-owned system in the Basque country of Spain, which I described. I won't go into it now. You can ask me questions. The other major obstacle in the way is the so-called Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is a diagram of employment versus interest rate. So the curve, what the curve says is, when the employment gets too good, then you have wage pressure, and that causes inflation. Now, of course, obviously it does if you don't have proper competition. But of course, we do not have, because we're a nation now of oligopolies and monopolies, and of course, in transnational corporations. I mean, there's not really much anyway. So anyway, the other thing to say is that, so what happens is, when we get down to about 4% unemployment, then the Federal Reserve will step in and start raising interest rates. And so you always have in America this reserve army of unemployed people by deliberate policy. It's not magic out of the sky, it's deliberate policy. And that number's about 8 million people. Now, of course, there are discouraged workers and older people, as we know, older people over 50 from corporations, they'll get fired because they're too expensive and too old, and they become the discouraged workers. So the number of them always unemployed in this country is probably, I don't know, 10 to 12 million or so, always there. It's a system. So, of course, when you have this number of people, and that's more than the population of Scandinavia combined, actually. But of course, the dogma of the right wing would say these people are scroungers, we can't pay them any benefits, even though the working of the system creates this. All right? That's the way it works. Okay, so what does economic democracy say? Well, I believe that you have to have funding brought back to the local level, to regions. I believe that instead of having job centers, we have the business creation centers, funded on the local level, regional level. I don't believe we should have these massive banks like Chase Bank, Bank of America, where all the money winds up in Wall Street to be misspent and gambled away. I think we have to bring back local banks, and I think you have what I call a super small business administration that works with the local banks, it works with the local education industries, and actually will fund startups. Because right now we spend tons of money making people unemployed and paying the social consequences of low pay and social strife. So as I said before, there's enough money there so the people who want to start a business, people who have a good, look, I work in Xerox. Now, I was brought over to work on computer printing. So I was the manager of 1200. That was the first machine that printed out these, like that, single. Before that, this didn't exist, apart from a computer. Okay, then we sat down, four engineers up in Rochester, as it was, and said, okay, we should go to the next level of machine based on the new fast copier. That language about 3 years, until Kodak came out with a machine and IBM did. And suddenly Xerox managed, good, there must be a market. Now to top it all, Xerox actually invented the electronic office. Windows, I mean, at the end of the 70s, we had machines that you could, basically Word, Microsoft Word came out of Xerox. And they had the whole damn thing working, and they basically gave it all away. The notion that these people are worth, I've never seen it. I think that, and of course you don't tell these geniuses anything, you'll get fired, right? What economic democracy says, we want Yeomen of England to control their own affairs. If you like to be rugged and independent, as some of us here do, that involves, I think, economic democracy. We'll have a say in the running of companies. And Mondragon model, they hire their own CEO democratically. If the bugger, can't make it, they fire him. That's called democracy. That's called economic democracy. Now, Jim here worked in a company that was employee-owned, so perhaps he can say a few words about that later on. But we badly need. So what do I think? Working a lot. So it's a central point where an entity, which I call a super small business administration, pulls from the educational institutes, banks, and so on and so forth, and funds startup, rather than these vulture capitalists coming in. They hang out. When I work at a company like that, hang around Berkeley in California, waiting to latch on to some research students' ideas and promote them, and then fund them a pittance and then walk away with the profits. No, I don't think that's fair, and I don't think it works. So I think anybody with a good idea, and also this applies at all levels. I think that in terms of education, we are failing. We should have a bipartisan, like an academic stream and then a technical stream, and that every young lad or lady should be assured that when they graduate, they will get a job. That's what we should aim for, full employment. And only government intervention can do that. It doesn't happen by the magic of the market. It does not do that, as Keynes said. All right. So, and the two levers to do that is fiscal policy spending by the government and monetary policy controlled by the Federal Reserve. I would combine the two together into one institution that controlled both. Because in the Reagan era, we had government Ronald Reagan and the great, underspender, in fact overspent. And there was Paul Volcker going the other way, jacking up interest rates, going in the other direction. I mean, completely opposite effects. That's what you have when you don't have joined up thinking. All right, so what happens under such a situation? Well, I think this would, we talk to young people and they want to start their own business. They don't like the corporate model. So this would foster entrepreneurship. It would foster innovation. Because, I worked in big corporations, the biggest. It's very difficult to sell an idea and get something going. It really, really is. And Jim, get up and speak to that, please. Oh. And I think this will, it involves a whole community, a whole area, okay? It is not the government doing, the government is there to provide the means, the seed money, if you like, to let the people, the little people at the bottom. It's the little guys that stand there and do the work. They know what's going on. The guys at the top almost never know what's going on because I wrote progress reports. It goes up the chain and it gets rosier and rosier. Ends up being a pack of lies. So, all right. And these people very often, they're not suited for these jobs. Usually they're salespeople and so on. They should be in charge of anything, and yet there they are, believing they're worth 10, 20 million a year, and they're not. So, how do we, so I think, for example, federal funding is necessary. For example, the coal mines in West Virginia will never come back. So I think to start such things of local entrepreneurship, it requires what I call a super SBA kind of thing, is needed. And the Chinese now have this long-term industrial policy where they're going to be the leaders in renewables and so on, in automation and so on. And they're a communist country. And by the way, I don't mind, rather than paying people to be unemployed and feel useless, I would pay them to start business. Okay, there'll be failures. 4 out of 5 new businesses fail anyway. That's about the average. So I'd rather people be trying and failing, and succeeding, than not. Also, when you do this, it takes away funding from the misspent casino of Wall Street. And so, how do you reward people? Well, you reward people according to their contribution to the bottom line. And that can be done to calculate what's your contribution to the bottom line. And I had a method of doing that I pitched to Oracle at one point. It wasn't really understood or needed, apparently. But it's people, sometimes people work in companies and they don't really know what they're doing or what they're contributing. Now, it's much easier and works much better if you say, look, you're working to fund the bottom line here, and you show them what that means. Okay. Now, in terms of the range in Mondragon, it's top to bottom salary is about 3 to 1. Now it can go to say 10 to 1, but that's about the limit. I don't see why anybody would be earning 1,000 to 1. These people are just not worth it. I've never seen them being worth it. Of course, they sit on their own. Corporations now run backwards. It was set up whereby you have the investors, and then the investors appoint the board of directors, who then select the CEOs and so on. It's now got reversed. The investors are only there for 20 seconds, I think it is on average. So it works in reverse. The the CEOs come along and they sit on the board, they appoint their own remuneration committee, so no wonder they jack up their salaries. That's why you've got this huge wealth imbalance. So I think if we have a community-focused situation, we will have an improved society whereby we want to create damn near full employment. And that can be managed and done. And Keynes showed how to do it. And I think if that happens, USA could be made great again. And we won't have the strife that we have today. That's my talk, folks.
Questions now?
I guess I just got through me.
Do we need the microphone or can
Yeah.
we do it orally? We need the microphone. We need the microphone.
Definitely need the
Okay.
microphone.
So it'll go on the recording.
Okay. Well, I can get loud enough if
I
necessary.
know you have a good voice, I'm sure.
Yeah, I learned you have to be loud in court because many of the
But it
judges
still-
are deaf and
It still does not get on the recording like you think it does.
Okay. Can we hear me? I guess we can.
Yeah.
You kind of glossed over when you were talking about the Federal Reserve. You made no mention of the LIBOR or the London.
Yes, the microphone
Hold
is to
your
talk
mouth.
into.
Hold close.
Hold it
Close.
There we go, yeah.
You made no reference to the LIBOR, the London Interbank Overnight Rate,
Right.
the SIBOR, the SHIBOR, which our Fed uses to make our rates. Those you didn't. There's no reference. It was like in your presentation, everything comes from the Fed, which I totally don't believe is even close. Those are the regulators for international business, which our country is kind of like the tail that's being wagged by the dog of Europe and Asia. Then you talked briefly about Dodd-Frank and the mortgage situation. You didn't discuss specifically where millions of homes were foreclosed because Dodd-Frank, which was supposed to be a Democrat Party initiative, that was the primary focus of it. Instead of providing protection, you're right, they watered it down so much with something called the single point of contact rules that 6 million people lost their homes. They were foreclosed in a short period from 2000, roughly 5 on through 2008, and it's still continuing somewhat. We saw banks fail over that, but you kind of glossed by that. You talked about the past, but you didn't use the one that you didn't discuss. The one thing that always affects the economics, that's crisis diplomacy and crisis. None of the theories of the past will hold up if you have a crisis. Nothing. I don't see it.
Okay.
Can you make that into a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I can respond to that, sure.
Yeah. When you talk about our national treasure being sold off by government, here's
You
my
can let him
question.
respond to a part of it.
Yeah, but I was going to finish with my
Let's pass this question.
You said make it a question, so
Make
about
it,
selling off national treasure.
yeah, make it one question at a time, you know.
Okay, didn't Hillary Clinton sell off our national uranium treasure?
Okay. Let me try to respond. Okay. All right. The Federal Reserve does set interest rates by buying and selling government securities. What they did, this quantitative easing, okay, where they poured, the Fed spent several trillion, I think, still on their books by buying securities. When they do that, they flood the market with money. That drives down interest rates. Yes, on the international scale, the LIBOR scandal has to do with the currency traders, and of course, the LIBOR scandal, the currency traders, as they do, were fixing the market because of, and of course, the London interbank rate. So yes, I would say that these traders always gain the market. There's scarcely a market that's not rigged. But yes, I would iterate to you again. Yes, the Federal Reserve, that controls the money supply and that controls the interest rate. By buying, they do it by buying and selling government securities.
how familiar are you with the offshore, onshore banking regulations of the People's Republic of China and the Pan-Am Bank? Or are you familiar with that at all?
I'm familiar with the fact that the Chinese, the national bank controls the whole value of the renminbi. And of course it's rigged against America's. In fact, actually, what they've just done, the Chinese, is to actually lower the value of the yen, the renminbi, vis-a-vis these tariffs. So they've negated some of them already, because the policy of tariffs is a bad policy. Now you can ask me what policy should be there, and I'll tell you, if you want. Yes.
A question. You said that when trying to figure out how people should be rewarded for their work, you said that it should be according to their contribution to the bottom line.
Right.
What about the investors and the shareholders? It seems to me they don't make any contribution at all. They don't create the product or provide the service. All they do is they act like a bank and just loan money.
Yeah,
So
well,
why do they, why should they get a dividend or,
Okay, in an employee-owned company, you don't have shareholders. I mean, the shareholders are the employees, which is what I would advocate. Now, there must be obviously capital, and I would advocate in a proper market that it's done by bonds. These companies can buy. In fact, bonds are the biggest market anyway. If you want to invest in a new factory, you write a bond for it, and then of course that means to say that you're going to pay a given, it's at a given interest rate, and when the bond is new, you pay it back.
So a bond is just like taking out a loan.
Yeah, it's like a mortgage, really.
Like a mortgage, so
Yeah.
it's just the lender, of the money,
Yeah.
the bondholder, all they get back is the agreed upon interest.
Yeah, and they have no power in managing the company, because so that's the question: how do you fund an employee-owned company? Well, you do it by issuing bonds. As central governments do, as the city of Dallas does. And so and look, in the startup case where you need funding, I think it's done out of funds that would otherwise go to paying people to be unemployed and so on and so forth. Yeah. So.
You said that the GDP did break 3% under Obama. Where did you get your data for that?
A quarter.
By quarter.
It happened
Well, there's
by
only
quarter,
three
not year by
quarters in
year.
8 years that have broke 3%. It never broke 3% for a year.
No, there were 3 or 4 quarters when it was up over 4%.
But it didn't break 3% for the year.
No,
No.
for the quarter, just
For the quarter,
just
okay.
as Trump's last
That's fine.
quarter, but was this last quarter? Yeah, it was 4.1%. Well, as I said, that happened under Obama 4 times actually, 4 or 5 times. I don't know the exact number, but yeah. So
John, we have different definitions, obviously, for the phrase neocons. So I think I'm on the side of textbook definition. Can you please give me what your definition is?
Okay, well, the true definition is called neoliberalism. Now, of course, in America, liberalism means socialism, see? And so, but the true classical definition is neoliberalism, which is laissez-faire. That's the true definition. Now, I don't use it, but because it's a confusing term. But what it does mean, it's the economy as dictated as set down by the classical economists like Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marshall, and so on.
Well, before I give the mic back to Nathan, here I had one other thing.
Yeah.
I'm trying to fathom this thing about the peasant class here in this country. I realize I don't make much money, but I get kind of offended when I'm called a worker, or whenever anyone is kind of putting me in a class. And I think a lot of Americans feel that way. So can you work on that a little bit and give me a better?
Yeah, actually, I define that term, and I'll define it again for you. Peasant comes from the French paysans. It means persons without land. And I said, really, the equivalent people today are people without economic background or asset. So they don't have, as I'm saying, they aren't like yeomen who are self-supporting by their own efforts. Okay, so really, that's why there really are people without the wherewithal to support themselves, other than by being working for a wage.
But the yeomen supported themselves on the commons, and the commons were in fact owned by somebody. So that's-
Nominally, they were owned by the Lord of the Manor, but in order to keep them sort of alive, I suppose, right, they had to make their own living, which they did off the common lands. They were common lands to that local population. So what I'm saying is, in America, well, my view is you should have yeomen of America that own their own livelihood by virtue of they own part of the business they work at.
But we have no commons in this country. There are no commons that are not owned by the king.
Well, you don't have a king. You have a potential king, but not a king. No. We have a rapidly diminishing industrial society that we have to somehow recreate. I mean, you realize we don't have hardly any pharmaceutical manufacturing in America anymore. I mean, we've had industry after industry after industry being shut down by people I call greedy, incompetent, and immoral, because they've sabotaged this country. So the question is, how do you get it back? You'll never get it back by the Trump class. They're doing fine already. Their business model is buy overseas cheaply and sell at America high. Well, the only problem is the average American is going bankrupt. And so, now, selling the family silver was mentioned. What did I mean by that? Well, when you run a trade deficit of 20, cumulative, since 1979, cumulative trade deficit, 20 trillion. Now, so to pay for that, you have to pay 20 trillion of your assets, of the country's assets, bonds, businesses, and so on. And England has done the same thing for the same ideological reasons. That's why if you go to, I've mentioned this before many, many times, there's not one investment bank English owned anymore, not one car company English owned anymore. All the infrastructure, like London Airport, is owned by the Spanish. I mean, they've sold the damn country out. And it was because of this ideology. Okay? And the same thing is happening here, exactly. I saw it happen in England. I knew what would happen. When Ronald Reagan came in, you know, the broken down BMU reactor, a mouthpiece to the neocons, I said then, many moons ago, in the early 80s, this is what is going to happen.
Richard Nixon came along with something called the most favored nation trading status and upped China, the People's Republic of China, into that. Don't you think that the global wage rate was precipitated by that action, giving China a paramount economic power, making a powerhouse? And I'll throw in a secondary question. Pat Paulson talked about the trickle-down theory of Reagan economics, and he said it trickled down Reagan's leg onto the public. Would you agree with that?
I've got a, well, it's akin to that saying, I've got a warm feeling and it's running down my leg. You know, look, I don't know if you've read my book or want to read it, I've got a few copies. No, this America's been self-sabotage. I cannot believe that a country would have done this to itself. Basically bankrupted itself, you know, engaged in ridiculous wars, you know, run around, massive damage to no great purpose.
But what about China and the most favored nations?
Well, that was lunacy to begin with, right? I mean,
Didn't that trigger what we have today,
Well-
the major problems?
yes, it was the start of the main, and then, of course, Clinton cinched the whole thing by ushering China into the WTO, which they've broken all the rules, stolen intellectual property. I mean, total madness. These people, as they say, every senator that appears on the steps there in Washington with the American lapel on their, they're all traitors. They've been complicit in selling the country out. I mean, the public should be outraged at this.
We are.
Yeah, well, where are you? Why aren't you in the streets protesting it? You know?
I am almost in the street.
Yeah, you know.
Oh, one more question about those employee-owned companies and if they have the bonds. If the employee-owned company goes bankrupt, who is liable for those bonds?
Well, that's it. You know, that's it. And if the bond goes down, that's it. You've lost the money.
The bond
Defaults.
holder,
Yeah, you can default. It defaults. Yeah.
Well, no one loses their money.
But they lose the money.
they just lose the money.
Just like if you buy a stock and it fades away, you know, you've lost it. You know.
They get the assets. No, they get the assets.
No, there
The
is
bondholder always gets the assets of the company was left.
The bondholders always have first claim on the assets. Actually.
Okay.
You know, so yeah, they will get like, I don't know what it will be, like say 10 cents on the dollar, but they will get some money back.
John, I'm hearing the inequality conundrum being invoked again.
Yes.
And
Well,
this economic inequality is the only reason I have any work at all. Is that there are people with a little more than the mean than there are attorneys and engineers, and I never get hired. But
okay.
if you want an
Let me-
example of complete economic equality,
Yes.
you can find that in Somalia. I'd like your comment on that.
Okay. I never said at any point there will be economic equality. What I said was you get rewarded depending on your contribution. You get what you put in, but you do it on a fair basis. Okay. I mean, you could work for a company, for example, a employee-owned company, and it goes bust. Okay, you see, in a situation where businesses are always being, you know, we need, like to jump to a principle. You know, what capitalism is supposed to do is businesses disappear, new ones crop up. The only problem is that the main feature seems to be export them abroad. And so we aren't creating enough businesses in America. So we have to find a way of doing it. I'm proposing one, a solution if you want. Okay?
Okay, one other quick question here
Yeah.
is, there is enough blame to go around all over the place, I'm sure, but you were speaking of 20 trillion in debt.
Cumulative trade.
Cumulative debt, actually it's much more than that, but
It's a bit more than that,
But,
that's roughly.
isn't it true that during the Obama era, that at least 9 trillion was added to that? I think it was more like 10.
Yeah.
No, it's,
So
okay.
what is your comment on that?
Okay. My comment was that the way a country can climb out of recession is by fiscal spending. It's called priming the pump. Okay, so because what happens in a recession is that everyone wants to leave the scene. You know, so a small company, for example, say it has 10 employees. Well, then say the demand for the product drops, and you're supposed to fire people. Okay? Now corporations will do it automatically. Okay? So you have this death spiral going on. Now the thing is, as economists said in the 1930s, well, in the long run, this thing will recover naturally. And Keynes said, well, in the long run, we'll all be dead. You know, the thing is that economies can recover, for example, by extra government spending. Now, what they must do, like right now, actually, the economy is climbing up. Now you start cutting government spending. All right? That's what Trump is doing is spending this extra money, which has gone to the wealthy, which is not productive spending. Okay? precisely the wrong time to the wrong people.
Well, along that theme, Vladimir Putin actually made a jab at Trump, and he asked the question, where were we getting these $700 billion we were spending on our military? And of course, the question mark is, what were we doing? Were we just printing the money?
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's where the money comes from, you print it.
You're the economist here.
Well,
Since Russia came up years ago, Karl Marx said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Now, isn't income tax from each according to his ability, and welfare and social programs to each according to his need? And if so, aren't we, if we subscribe to those two theories, actually following Marx's concept in the United States?
well, I haven't seen it. I have not seen it, actually. But look, okay, you may have been here or you may not have been here, I don't know. But I talked about the supply side curve, actually. And I tended I showed that the cheapest supplier is really a monopoly supplier because it's the economies of scale. And when it comes to a service, like a government service, the government, it's like really the Social Security, the running costs of it are very, very cheap, actually. Okay. Now, the thing is, with all these things, if you live in a society where you have public sector workers that provide public services, and it is, for example, in England, under Thatcher, we privatized all the railways. Immense chaos ensued. And basically, let's take academies, okay? Now, the theory has been in this country, and I guess it came from this country probably, went to England, the notion that academies run by businessmen are a great idea. That because they're businessmen, they're going to run it much more efficiently, you see. So what happens? Well, of course, several things happen. The first one was that, of course, the guy that takes over pays himself 3 or 4 times what the principal did in the first place. He then looks around and says, look at this. My company, or my relative's company, can supply the catering services. They can no, it's a lovely money machine for a few people. That's what has happened. Now, the other thing that happened, and this is why if I ever talk about England, I'd be more, had more vitriol really than I've done tonight. So the government says, oh boy, we've made all this wonderful neocon ideas like businessmen running schools, for example. It must be running cheaper. So they cut the funding. And guess what? Half the academies have gone out of business. And of course the other thing, of course, is that they're dying to privatize the National Health Service, sell it to United Healthcare probably. And you try to get any sense out of United Healthcare and WellMed and see how well joined up this whole damn mess of an American healthcare system is. Plus, of course, under the great notion of free market and trade, they're buying all these shocking drugs, from India and China. Goodness knows what's in them. I mean, it's an entire lunacy driven by dogma that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Now, if you think it works and it's all wonderful, good for you. I don't think it works.
I think you're about
Okay, sorry.
I have a question for you, John.
Yes,
Do you
sure.
not think it would be extremely beneficial to the United States to enforce the Constitution, which says only our federal government has the right to print and coin our money, and circumvent, obviate, or eliminate, or negate, and put an end to the private banking cartel
Yes.
called the Federal Reserve Banking
Yeah.
System,
No.
which is not part of our government.
Right.
It's a international banking cartel,
Right.
which now has turned the entire country and everybody in it into debt slaves. And we could save about roughly 400 to 500 billion a year in interest, which we have become debt slaves to pay, which is a tremendous burden on every man, woman, and child in this country, which is totally an illegal enterprise because our Constitution says that only our government has the right to print and coin and mint our money, not a private international
Yeah.
banking cartel.
Yeah, the fly in the ointment. Well, two things. One, you must run the money supply and the fiscal spending in parallel. Those are the two levers of an economy. And really, it should be one institution in government. Okay. Now, the problem is, who could you trust to run it? Now, the yeah. Well, sure. That's the reason. This is why, in England, you've got the Monetary Policy Committee. Okay, that basically runs the money supply in England, and it's staffed by. And actually, my college in London is Imperial. And he's an expert in this intangible business. For example, in London there's a King's Cross station, and the platform I think is 9 3/4, because that was mentioned in J.K. Rowling's book. Okay, it's very famous. So you've got this tourist industry based on this thing that doesn't exist. You see, it's the intangible economies really. And that is his expertise, is really, we're moving to a more intangible world and so on, where there's a legitimate business, because we should have more money in the leisure time and so on. Anyway, so what I'm saying is, you must have an oversight committee staffed by academics, economists and so on, but not, so there must be an oversight to this, just as there has to be, just as in the law. In Scandinavia, you have an ombudsman. I mean, if you're an argument with the city of Dallas, for example, which seems to be running amok, by the way, you go to the ombudsman, and you can present your case, and it must be heard and answered. And so the little person should always have an avenue to speak to power and government, because it's our government. They work for us. Now, when they work for themselves and their buddies. As I said this before, if you're going to have a constitution, the first article should be the defense of democracy. Because we're a civilization. We say, okay, we appoint people to govern the country in our best interest. Now, when they start cheating on us, again, they go to jail for almost forever. And as for bankers who do the same thing, they should be in jail as well.
Well,
Because people. The problem really is just as in the 70s, when the young lost faith in the institutions. I think the people in this country. This is why Trump was elected. They lost so much faith that they wanted someone to go there and kick everything, and they really didn't care what happened because they had nothing to lose. They'd already lost their jobs. And I don't blame them. I do the same. I mean, I had no time for both parties. There's no party that really stands for the average, hard-working American. Okay.
Do you favor the Spanish audiencia system, whereby the politician is called up at the end of his term
And
has
shot.
to answer to the public and then give back everything he earned if they find he was corrupt?
Absolutely. But I'd do that well before the end of his term. I would let him serve the term out.
But that's how they used to do that with the gubernadors in Texas,
No,
and before that in
well,
Mexico and Spain followed, and it seemed to work.
Democracy can only work if these people are public servants and serve the public interest. I mean, as Abraham Lincoln said, the Gettysburg Address, this must be government of the people, by the people, for the people. And when you have a kleptocratic class that just steals from the people, writes all the laws in it, you don't have democracy. And I don't think people, if you talk seriously to people, believe we do anymore. But that's what happened, and it's this system. And you have a 17th century political system, is what you have, and you're stuck with it. The problem is a lot of institutions were written in America, and they're frozen in time, and they should move on, and they haven't. And that's the problem. You have to have, the wealth of a country really depends on the collective work of the entire population, everybody. So everyone should be educated properly, give a fair crack of the whip, get good justice, and so on and so forth. Okay? It shouldn't depend on how much money you've got, who you can bribe, and all the rest of it. That's corruption. And when you don't have that, we're headed, basically, with these people, we're headed towards a fascist society is what we're headed towards, actually. And so, for progress, so I'm all for, like we meet here and talk, and in running a company, you should do the same thing. And the people with the best ideas, if they get accepted and they're talked over, fine, they get rewarded. Okay? And I've said before, sometimes it may be the janitor, who cleans a place and gives the place a glowing appearance that's worth much more money than the CEO. I don't know, how you value these intangible services, but it can be done. And I'd say I propose the whole system of doing that, where people feel that they're worth something and they're rewarded on efforts that go towards the bottom line. And it's an employee-owned company, the books are open. They can see what's going on, they can see how the spending's gone on, they can see where the jobs are coming in and all the rest of it. And when they feel part of it, they'll step forward with ideas because it's their company. And I've said before, in London, the most prestigious department store and grocery store is employee-owned. About 100,000 people, John Lewis and Waitrose. And in Florida, Publix is employee-owned. And people died to get those jobs. Okay? They don't want to work for Walmart, who pays them lousy wages, and it's the theory. For example, the way John's not with us anymore is but the theory of capitalism whereby, we're going to pay the people as little as possible. Well, where's the demand coming from? But from public spending. If you pay them low wages, it's like Walter Reuther and Henry Ford walked around, and Henry Ford said, "Look at all the robots we've got making all these cars." And Walter Reuther said, "Well, do robots buy cars?" There has to be a balance, really. There has to be a balance in this world. And when you don't have a balance, and it goes off kilter, and we do not have a balance, then things go to pot. And I think this country is at a turning point. Yes, it went off track with Kissinger and Nixon going to China, and it further went off balance when Clinton signed China into the WTO. So you heard, just as I said at my beginning, I think that as politicians of every party in England, one way or another, has betrayed the country. Every one of them. And I think in this country, again, the same thing, They've allowed too much corporation power. They've destroyed livelihoods. You talked about banks foreclosing on people, and there was this funny paperwork going on. And the Royal Bank of Scotland, for example, was actually forcing small businesses, to steal their assets, right? Greed and stupidity and immoral behavior is not uniquely American. No, it's everywhere. The virus of greed eventually goes everywhere. And as I said at the beginning, or near the beginning, greed ruins everything. So, anyway, any other, I'd be delighted to answer any and all questions. I whizzed through Keynes.
One last question.
Yeah, sorry, I do recommend you read what he says. John Maynard Keynes, it's called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. I mean, he says a lot of things in here that apply today about what you do. Anyway, it's a tough read. I mean, you'd really have to read it twice if you were to put together the whole concept. Yeah, like Hicks actually did the ISLM curve, which he condensed it. But that's not everything that Keynes said. It's just a simplification of it. His main point was, look, this high employment doesn't happen naturally, just by laissez-faire. It almost never does. And so every now and again, the Fed steps in, or the government steps in. And really what the Fed did, it really carried the load by lowering interest rates down. And it's like, the trade policy. They didn't listen to Keynes. I won't go back because I've talked all about in the past what he said, what would have happened. If Keynes' policies had been adopted, you'd have had balanced trade. You never would have had all these jobs leaving and so on and so forth.
One last question.
Yes.
So, do you think it would be a good idea then to cancel all debt now owed to the Federal Reserve, which has no legal right to coin or print or mint or money that they have all created out of thin air, by making a ledger entry into the system, cancel all that debt, and by declaring the Federal Reserve banking system null and void, and printing and minting our own money backed by gold or silver or precious metals, to give it actual inherent intrinsic meritorious pecuniary value, and cancel all debt to the Federal Reserve and free up that 400 to 500 billion of interest that is being paid to them on money they create out of thin air illegally, since it's unconstitutional.
Well, well, after the war in England, the National Bank of England was nationalized. Now, Tony Blair made it private, the Labour government made it privatized it again. No, I don't agree with private banks owning the money supply. I mean, it's a reductio ad absurdum what they do. No, as I said, I think there should be one entity that actually controls. I mean, look, Keynes' whole notion was macroeconomics. You have to apply, fiscal spending and monetary spending together to have it in balance. And so there must be one entity that controls that. But it must be an entity that is composed of remarkable individuals that can't be corrupted, and that's the problem.
Have you read all of the volumes of Das Kapital at least once?
I read most of it. I wouldn't say I read all of it.
But
I have not read all of it. No. Well, I have read most of it. Yeah. I think school, I read that when I was young. Just as I read a book called British Economic Policy Since the War. And so, but I read, most of these economists, but most economic students do read Marx, actually. I mean, it's one of the, you might not agree with his ideas necessarily. I mean, I think he was right about some things and wrong about others. I think the final conclusion, was wrong. And also why? Because he was the first person that tackled the problem of trade cycles, actually.
So you understood dialectic
Materialism.
Yeah.
I understood what it said. I don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions, okay? But the thing is, before you criticize something like that, you have to read it. That's what I'm saying.
Gets heavy.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, it's difficult to write economics in words. I mean, and when it verges into terminology, as Keynes does now and again, it can be incomprehensible. But I hope I made the point that really the essence of Keynes is that supply does not necessarily create demand. I mean, the two don't normally work, for reasons I went into. So, and that was the essence. And his point was, yes, the US pulled out of the slump in the 30s by massive government spending, deficit spending, the war. Yeah, sorry.
Has the United States been in debt ever since World War II?
No, no.
When did we first get into debt?
1939, 1959.
1959. So we actually paid off all of the debt
Yeah.
that we accrued from World War II?
Yes.
We paid it
Yeah.
off, and then in 59, it was our
Well, okay,
national
okay.
debt.
There are two debts to talk about. There's the trade deficit and then the federal budget deficit.
I was talking about the federal budget.
Yeah, the federal, yes. In actual fact, to make monetary policy work, you almost have to have a government debt. Because you buy and sell government bonds to actually change interest rates to operate the economy. So you almost have a running debt, actually. If you have no debt, then there's no government bonds to sell, right? It's a paradox, but that's true. Now, the thing is that it's just like you have your credit card, right? I'm sure at the end of the month you have a debt, but you have enough income to pay it. So the thing is that debt's okay, provided you have enough income to pay the debt. But the money supply does require to have outstanding government bonds. Yes, it does. Because otherwise, as I say, you couldn't run a money supply under our present scheme. But again, you know, it's a fact of the matter. Any other questions, please? John, you've been quiet at the back. This is now a rebuttal. I'll take my words away.
I'll go start it off.
All right.
I can stand up long enough.
Okay.
Well, John, you referred to me a time or two tonight,
Yes, I
so
did.
I thought I would go ahead and make the comments. I've told you some of this in the past, but I'll repeat real quickly. My perspective. You know, if you don't know the perspective of the person who's speaking, you don't know whether to believe a dang word they say or not, right? I told you a little bit about John's background, and it's substantial and it's impressive, and it gives him the ammunition to speak about a lot of what he speaks about. When I went through college and I just did a bachelor's degree. I'm not a PhD. I'll acquiesce to Mr. Beesley. But I sort of triple majored in accounting and became a CPA from that, in economics. And I will mention I was very fortunate in the 2 semesters of money and banking. The second year we had a professor on loan from London. I don't remember which college. He was great. And then I took microeconomics and macroeconomics from a teacher from Beirut. And you just sort of had to sit on the first 2-3 rows or you might not understand everything he said. But he was very wise. He really gave us good ideas. And basically all of the economics that was taught was Keynesian. One of the simple models I remember from that was that, you know, you have a period of time when the country, the USA, gets in trouble. So the government funds some programs to dig us out of the ditch. Whether they have the money sitting there in the bank or they borrow the money, they spend it one way or another. The premise was, the professors would tell us, but I've never seen it operate, was in that time the government borrows money. And then when the economy recovers, and it starts acting like it's been acting the last 6 months, you start paying the debt down. You pay back the money that you borrowed to bail you out of the trouble you're in. It's sort of like you or I as individuals, when we're 23 years old and we're establishing our household and we get in a hole, and we go borrow money from our parents. You know, if we want to be in our parents' will, we'll probably better pay that back, right? At least that's the way I think about it. I would want to pay it back, but even if I didn't want to pay it back, which is untrue, I would feel obligated to pay it back. I'd be stupid to not pay it back. I had an interesting perspective in my work that relates to some of the things that John says. I started off in public accounting with one of the big international, now demised, gone away, destroyed by the guy who is now trying to destroy the president, Arthur Andersen and Company. There were probably about 4 crooks in the company. But he was determined he's going to teach everybody a lesson, so he took the whole company down. It was eventually overturned. He got no votes in the Supreme Court. He was totally wrong. But by that time, the firm had been dissolved. All the employees had been hired by somebody else. It had gone to Never Never Land. But I learned some valuable skills working there because I worked with all different kinds of businesses in different industries. It was diverse. I didn't get just stuck on Halliburton and spend 9 months of my year there. I worked on a lot of different things. I left there and I went to work for a manufacturing company that had 10 divisions, was publicly owned on the American Stock Exchange, and I had a variety of responsibilities at the corporate office. But one of the things I would do after year end is I put together a report that was almost 100 pages long, and we didn't have all the magic, just push the button and it would come out. Reports off the computer, I had to assimilate a lot of that stuff and put it together. So it's quite a challenge. But the result for me was, when I got through with that, I knew everything there was to know about every division in that company and what they had been doing. And so when I would go out and visit them and audit their books, I knew exactly which leaf to turn over. And I caught some of them doing some pretty raunchy things. That was an invaluable lesson, but that was a form of government that is, of business that's very prominent today. With respect to the type of business that John referred to, I had an invaluable experience with that. I went to work with a group of guys from Chicago who had set up a recruiting and consulting firm. And at the time I went to work there, they had a profit sharing plan for about 2 years. And then someone advised them to organize an ESOP. Does anybody know what an ESOP is? An employee stock ownership plan. So we began buying. We took all of our money out of the profit sharing plan and we bought shares from the founding shareholders. Well, the employees eventually owned all of it. Well, guess what? We made, just like John has said, this is a perfect example. What he says absolutely works. The decisions we made in that company at our desk, on our job, were not selfish decisions to us. They were decisions that were made to maximize the profit of that business because the value of the business went up. When they set up the ESOP, the value, we had a company in Chicago that came in and valued the company. It was worth $2.13. I don't think I'll ever forget that number. And I offered shares for sale 5 years later, and the offer was $25. So what we were doing as employees of that company was creating value for the founders of the company who still kept some of their shares, but we were creating value for ourselves. That was the best darn motivator of anything you could imagine. Because every morning when I got up and I went to work, I realized that although I was not taking the risk of going out and starting a business up on my own and risking not being able to feed my family, which I did later, I got gutsy. But at that point in time, I would not have had the nerve to do that. But these guys, that kind of system that John has referred to, allows employees to have the motivation to do the right thing for the company instead of just showing up for work. Does that make sense? I mean, that was a valuable thing to me. It did not make me a millionaire because I was in it so early in the program, it was not big enough yet. Later on, it did become that way, but it was invaluable to me because it taught me value. It taught me the motivation of a person doing the right thing, not when they're in their home, but when they're on the job. It benefits the company the most because what I learned was I could make the value of the company go up more than what I could generate in day-to-day value in my work because of the multiplier effect. When the company profits went up, the value went up even more because they expected them to go up more. So that is a very valuable tool. John espouses it among many other things, but I've experienced it and I can tell you, I know that it works. I wish we had more of it. Companies would be, a lot of these families that end up in their later years with a company that they own, they've had all their life, they've become umbilically attached to it. They can't stand to separate themselves from it. But if they would have the guts to do what these three guys who started this company up did and start selling their shares off to their employees and motivate their employees to work their tails off and not complain about it, the world would be a better place.
Well, I think anyone who speaks emphatically and pounds their fist about matters of economics has simply not really studied it that closely, because it is a very complex field. One of the things that amazes me is someone like a John Corzine can somehow or other not be prosecuted for doing a bail-in on, how much was that? About $1.something billion of the accounts he was entrusted with. Of course, Jamie Dimon had made some comment that Corzine was going to be swimming with the fishes if he didn't come up with some of the money he'd bet. So it's just a matter of, we have a kind of a two-tier system. If there's only two tiers, where you have people prosecuted for minor infractions, and then people who really have taken many people to the cleaners. I mean, actually, Andrew Weissman bringing down Arthur Anderson, I would think that since he hid exculpatory evidence and did some, I mean, we have a lawyer here in the audience. Are there any criminal penalties for hiding exculpatory evidence when you're prosecuting somebody?
Yes, there are some penalties. The prosecutor's duty, if there's exculpatory evidence, is to turn it over to the defense attorney.
But when they don't do it?
When they don't do it, then somebody has to bring an action
Okay,
at
but
some level against them. A special prosecutor may be needed. But
okay, well,
the
we
rule is,
definitely
and
need a special prosecutor.
The courts are bound then, if there's exculpatory evidence that wasn't turned over, if it's a criminal case, to dismiss.
Okay, but see,
The
that still
entire
doesn't,
case. It's
that still
called
doesn't
fruit of-
deal with the misbehavior
No,
of
but
the attorney.
it's called fruit of the poisonous
Prosecutor.
tree doctrine.
Fruit of the
And
poisonous
you
tree
cannot
doctrine.
use that if there's something that's poisoned or tainted, and withholding that is a taint. Now, they get around that in Dallas County years ago. I want
Okay,
to
well,
see
when
evidence.
you get up here to speak, maybe you
Well, I
can.
wasn't gonna add on to that, I was just gonna say that.
Well, maybe we could give you an extra minute here, but I want to make sure I use mine here usefully. I think that the capitalist system here in America, and I don't even like that term. That's a term which, under its common usage, that meaning was coined by Marx. So why would you step into that arena? But everybody does. But the capitalist system in this country has been kind of like a thoroughbred racehorse who has been weighted down with so much weight to run the race that it's hobbling along and everybody's saying, look, capitalism has failed, capitalism has failed. But if you start analyzing all the different ways the wealth of this country is being tapped off, it's phenomenal. We can even get by, really. And one of the things that I think people miss is slavery is a very insidious thing. There are many different types of slavery, and it can be happening to a person in a way you don't really. I mean, you may not think you're in a situation of slavery, but if your wealth or your assets are being drawn off, then yes. But see, there's one of the big considerations here is what is really wealth. I would like to. I mean, this has been a great historical discussion here, but I don't feel it's as contemporary as it could be. Because one of the great wealths in this country that we all benefit from is the infrastructure. And that's more profound. It's kind of like the water that us fish are swimming in, and we don't really realize. But you go to some other country, and you learn what the essentials are. One of those high on the list is just working plumbing. Having some way to deal with your waste. I mean, this is what engineers talk about. They say, well, the first thing you plan for is how do you do the waste disposal? Make sure you have that covered. Then there's the issue of electricity and water. Actually, water kind of comes under the waste thing because I haven't found anybody yet who's really pioneered dealing with human waste without water. I mean, maybe it's being done, but
Could be done, but it stinks.
Well, I mean, with the right enzymes, maybe we just kind of devour itself and then, move out into your garden and grow your plants for you. Who knows? But I'm not a Keynesian, and I think really most of the people in economics I follow are not Keynesians. Because this is debt-based economics. And I think the world has been plundered by America's use of the Keynesian system. Because every time we expand our money supply and we devalue the value of our dollar, then we've just basically plundered the economies of the world because they're using our dollars. And so the entire world suffers. The entire world suffers over the American excesses. And this is one of the things that Putin was complaining about there. Kind of a little jab. So, I don't think anyone here is particularly familiar with the Basel III agreement and the Basel III requirements. Nobody spoke about it or asked a question about it. So, just in real quick sum, it is putting the economies, the nations of the world, putting their currencies onto a asset-based basis, which is kind of what JD was talking about there. JR, I get it wrong all the time. Okay. And see, that's the thing, is if you don't have assets to back your currency, well then why not expand it? Why not devalue it? I mean, there's a lot of motive there, to get that first use on the currency before it devalues, and a lot of people do that. So anyway, under the new requirements, basically all the large nations of the world are are meeting those requirements. There have been little indications in the news, and what this really means is the Federal Reserve is going bye-bye. Now, it's not happening in the public eye. That might be disturbing to the markets, but I think you're going to find more and more that the Federal Reserve is being drawn under the Treasury, and the Treasury is having more to say with Federal Reserve policies. And I think going forward, that's going to be the thing. Now, one comment about China. I'm very critical of our economic relationship with China, but I also see the bigger picture, which is a picture in which, over these days since NAFTA gas, China has really brought about 30% of their population up from third world status into second world status. That is a huge worldwide accomplishment that I don't know if we know in world economics what the value of that really can be, whether that can be measured. Now, if China would get less authoritarian and become more free market from here on out, I think then they could raise up the rest of their population. So I think I've used my time.
I had a question. What happened to Milton Friedman and his economic theories? Nobody's talked about that at all.
Friedman, most of the economic gurus have had some fly in the ointment. I'm not going to comment on that because even the best of them, even some of my favorites in the Austrian School of Economics, some of them have kind of failed to cover everything too.
Money man.
Okay, Calvin.
I was trying to John, I enjoyed your comments and most of your conclusions. I don't know, I guess we all read what we read and are influenced by what we read and what we observe, and we come away with different pictures. Just on the historical part, we had the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that was enacted after World War II to try to prevent the same thing from happening in World War I. They had all these reparations and created an environment for Hitler to come in power, and the same thing in Italy. So the Marshall Plan was what we really used, and it was very successful. The Marshall Plan was, and at that point, we almost managed the International Monetary Fund. And Governor Conley was Secretary of Treasury when we got off the gold standard. And someone said we don't have enough gold to match our debt now. So that's not an option from my point of view. And greed, as you indicated, is what it is. I used to be almost a disciple of Peter Drucker. I mean, you know Peter Drucker. He was a great consultant to business, large corporations. And then, I guess, in his later life, he wrote a book encouraging multinational corporations to get more involved in politics. And things have gone downhill ever since then, because they can buy what they want. And they don't look at what's in the national interest of the United States, but what's in their interest. And so that's one of the things that he's one of the people that I love and don't love so much right now. We argue about regulations. Now, my concept as a political science and science and economics is the government is supposed to set a framework. And sometime, in order to implement the framework, you do have to have regulations. And we go back to the Glass-Steagall Act that was enacted for World War II, and then which was done away with, and we had the process in 2007 and 8. If the corporations are not concerned for my interest, it's their interest. And somebody has got to be the gatekeeper to see the people play fairly. And I think it's an unbalance because they are so concerned with their greed and what they want, and they don't look at the other people. And we do have real issues that we need to deal with. If we don't, we're going to have real problems. And I feel that I argued with NAFTA we didn't need free trade, we need fair trade. And it seemed that we developed agreements where we thought that the United States was invincible. We're not. We owe a lot of debt. And so the free markets, you get into the stock market, they're manipulators in many ways. And the multinational corporations, they actually plan to make things happen. But the federal government tried to plan, they played the socialist communist thing. And the federal government needs to plan to proact and not just react. We react most of the time. And that's what's creating some of the problems we face right now. I think we need a better equilibrium. We need a better equilibrium that's fair for both the corporate community and the citizens. And I feel that as citizens, we let politicians polarize us on what I call peripheral issues. And we go on fighting among ourselves, and they go ahead and get what they want at our expense. And one of the things that one of the political parties believe in, that tax cuts is going to solve the problem. The economy is so large right now, it doesn't have a major impact. And I observed that when President Bush, George W. Bush was president, he had tax cuts 2 or 3 times. It wasn't really a tax cut, it was kind of like a rebate. But it didn't stimulate the economy, it got worse. The thing I think you pointed out is the job market, the structure of work in the United States has changed. It's never going back to where it was with assembly lines and that kind of stuff. And we need to retrain people for the jobs that exist. We import a large number of people with skills to do that we don't have. We need to train our own people to do that. And I think you got to get in there for your knowledge can equal to, a balance. You can decide what you want to be marginal, what you want to be more than marginal, whether you want to make a lot of money. And I think the education system needs a lot of restructuring. So when our students graduate, they can analyze, they can articulate, and do things objectively and not from a subjective standpoint. So I think a lot of the issues you made. One of the things you and I disagree on, and everybody disagreed with me on the Federal Reserve Bank. Actually, when the Federal Reserve Bank in an open market operation buys and sells securities, they're selling buying and selling government securities. And when we borrow money, the $20-something trillion debt, we borrowed that. And that's figured into the monetary supply. And we supposed to pay that debt back. And so that's a big basis of the Federal Reserve does print Federal Reserve notes, but they work hand in hand with the Treasury Department. I'm certain the Treasury Department has some impact on them. But the reason is we don't trust either one of them. And it would be good if the Treasury and the Federal Reserve Bank could be the same thing, but we don't have the trust to do it. We split it up. One do fiscal, one do monetary. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. So those are some of the things I think we need to consider. And I always argue that if you're going to have a representative democracy, the vast majority of people have got to be pretty well educated and be able to think and make their own decisions. If we don't have that, it's not going to work. Thank you.
Yeah. Don't you think it would be better for us to be an imperialistic nation as opposed to sort of an internationalist country with weak borders? Isn't it better to have goods and money flowing into this country where we kind of have the world comes to our feet as opposed to us having to sit down and play global wage rates with countries that are undeveloped, many of them paying pennies per day to workers and lowering the overall income status.
The time for questions is over. We're in a remote.
Yeah, if you want to say something, go up and speak.
No, I was just asking, but that's okay.
Well, I know, but this is out of protocol. I think we have a global economy, and I think we have to be nationalists. One of my next presentations is what we have dealing with international relations was created by the United States after World War II. And if China becomes the dominant nation, what is it going to be then? And where do we go from here? And that's one of the things that I'll look at. Thank you.
Well, I don't begin to have the knowledge and the expertise of the people who have spoken here tonight, but I do have a few thoughts pertaining to wealth. And John said there's all different kinds of wealth and there's all different kinds of slavery. Doctors will say our first wealth is our health. And some will say mental health is our first wealth. And they even now list poverty as one of the causes of mental illness, one of the things that contributes to mental illness. It relates to wealth. It's not them. Another thing is, when I was making out that list, I noticed that Jana said to me tonight, there's not many women on here. Well, it said specifically that the ratio was 10 to 1, men to women. And I heard recently on the radio, is it like 74 cents on the dollar that a male makes, a white male, compared to a woman? She makes 74 cents compared to that. You're shaking your head no, but that's...
94 cents.
94. Is it 94?
Yep, absolutely. Been printed in every press in the United States,
Okay.
except for liberal Democrats who will repeat the 74 cent number, which is totally false. That's an accountant talking.
And I think they were accountants that put out these numbers, but anyway, and for the African American woman compared to the white male, it's even less. That was brought out public radio recently. And let me see what else, if I can make some sense out of this. Oh, a form of slavery. Teaching is becoming a form of slavery. They're taking away benefits. In Texas, we make $7,000, I don't teach now, but the research came out this week and said we make $7,000 less than the national average, in Texas. And our legislature has decided to cut down the percentage that they contribute to teacher retirement in the future. So they're trying to phase that out and take away resources, all kinds of problems with nothing to address the problems. That's turning into a form of slavery. And, well, yeah, that's it. I guess that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, I thank you for coming, and I certainly enjoyed your questions and so on. I think most people here would say that there is a problem in the USA. There really is something going on. The country isn't what it was, certainly when I came 50 years ago. As a whole, I mean, obviously some people are better off, but there's an unease because there's a general sense that the country is in trouble. I do think that the analogy I've used in the past, because I was a rowing man and the Henley Regatta has just ended, and my college won a major trophy, by the way, Imperial, which is good. If in an 8, if the whole 8 is pulling together, and in synchronism, you're going to win the race. If you have a cox that knows how to steer the boat into the most advantageous tide, you're also going to win the race. But when you don't really have a cox, you just hope. And a couple of guys at the front are smoking cigars and drinking whiskey, I think you're in trouble. And I think that's an analogy I could use on the USA. We just have to get our act together. And it's going to come, the whole community does. This is not an individual thing. Individuals by themselves cannot. This is a civilized country works together. And like a family. When a family works together, it's going to stay together. If a family starts to fall to pieces, the game's over. And you see that. And just mentioning the family values, when you have this low wage, low benefit, high unemployment situation, families suffer and fall apart, and you do have social strife, which is, I think, an immoral characteristic of this society. They don't care, really, and they denigrate the poor. They denigrate people who are thrown out of work as grounders and so. No, it's part and parcel generated by this system. So I want to have mechanisms to pull the community together, create jobs, create wealth, get this country on the track again. That's what I advocate.
John, what's the name of your book?
Sabotaging America. And you'll find it on Amazon. On Amazon.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. We appreciate seeing all of you. It's a pleasure.
I don't order from Amazon.
Sharing your views, that's all. That's what it's about.
I will donate it to you free of charge.
It used to be an area of
Thank you, sir.
barely connected to families.
I'd like to read it, so read it next time.
John, I'm going to not help clear here because I've got a health program in the morning and another
confidential and government review of documents, contracts.